Hello, everyone. My name is Etimof Young. Happy New Year, and welcome to ASLI's very first event for the year. Basically, what we want to do today is to review African and global space activities in 2024 and explore how 2025 could be. We have four experts in the house today who will be leading the discussion. And I'll introduce them shortly. First is Kwakusuma. Kwaku is the founder and managing director of Space Hubs Africa, a unique space space consultancy supporting policymakers, industry players, investors, and startups in the African space industry. He's been very active in the space industry for more than a decade, working as a consultant for European and African space institutions and companies, including the European Commission, the European Space Agency, the European Investment Bank, and of course, the African Union Commission. We also have Tongwane Namane, who is the commercial director at SES Space, one of the foremost space companies in Africa. It's based in Cape Town, South Africa. She has previously worked with and provided financial risk advisory to companies, banks, and the government. She has also held various consulting and corporate roles in several financial institutions with a global presence. We also have Ms. Shakindiritu, who is the Space Applications Training Officer at the African Union Commission. He has played a pivotal role in defining the African Outer Space Program, drafting of the African Space Policy and Strategy, and of course, the eventual establishment of the African Space Agency, which is due for inauguration in April this year. Misha oversees the institutional and human capacity development of the GMES and Africa program, which is an EU-funded program now in its third phase. He also leads the African Union's technical negotiations in the G20 Research and Innovation Working Group. Last but not the least, we have Dr. Samuel Oyewole, who is a research fellow at the African Center for the Study of the United States. There are just two of those institutions that I'm aware of in Africa. One is at the University of Pretoria in South Africa, and another one at the Wits University, also in South Africa. He's also part of the Oceans Regions Program at the Department of Political Science at the University of Pretoria, South Africa. He's the author of a book titled Utilitarianism in Outer Space, Space Policy, Socioeconomic Development, and Security Strategies in Nigeria and South Africa. So, colleagues, thanks so much for joining, and welcome again to the program. The format of the program will be as follows. I'll start off with the panelists, give them, say, like 5 to 7 minutes thereabout for some opening remarks or reflection. And then I follow up with some questions, and then I open the floor to everyone, to the audience, for interaction. Pending when the floor is open, we are all welcome to drop our comments or questions in the chat box. But I encourage that we keep ourselves muted until the interactive session. So to start off the discussion, I'll hand over to Kwaku for your opening thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Etim, and happy to be part of this discussion, looking at the African space industry, both in terms of what's happened and I guess also looking forward to what's going to come. I would also like to, at this point, wish Happy New Year to everybody in the call. Hopefully 2025 will be a fruitful and successful year for everybody in here. So with regards to the topic of today, I think at least the approach that I'll take is to basically just highlight some of the things that we've been sort of paying attention to at Space Hubs Africa over the past year, and then thinking also about what's coming in the next coming years. So, I mean, obviously a good place to start is always to look at how many satellites have been launched. This is something that I think a lot of people have been tracking over the years. In 2024, so last year, actually only 4 satellites were launched by Egypt. So the NextSat-1, Senegal, GAIN-DSat 1A, Zimbabwe, SimSat-2, and Djibouti's Djibouti 1B, which was actually just launched recently in December. This actually follows a trend that's kind of been decreasing over the past few years. So in 2022, there were 8 satellites launched, 2023, 5, and now only 4. So this is something that's interesting to look at. It's not necessarily concerning. A lot of satellite launches get delayed, postponed for a lot of different reasons, whether it's weather, whether it's manufacturing difficulties. So it's not something that's necessarily bad. In fact, what's more motivating or more interesting is to look at the next years or the upcoming years, right? Because a lot of different countries have now at least announced that they want to launch a satellite. So, I mean, in terms of 2024, Senegal was pretty much the only new country to launch a satellite. So Egypt, Zimbabwe, and Djibouti had all launched it. But in the coming years, it seems to be there will be a lot of new entrants. For example, Burkina Faso wants to launch their Burkina Sat-1 that they're currently working on. Of course, we don't know if any of these satellites will actually be launched in 2025, but at least there's the intention to do so. Tanzania and Ivory Coast, through the UN-COPUOS program, are planning on launching the TANSAT-1 next year. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are all collaborating with Russia to build telecommunication and remote sensing satellites. Morocco themselves are also working with Thales Alenia Space, so an international company, to develop a Moroccan satellite communication system. They also acquired 2 Earth observation satellites actually this past year from Israel Aerospace Industries. Nigeria planning to launch a constellation of 4 satellites in partnership with Pro-Force Galaxies next year. Botswana planning on launching their first satellite, the BOTSAT-1, in early 2025. The DRC is planning on purchasing the satellites actually, and they signed an MOU with a Monaco satellite operator. And as well, Rwanda is building their first CubeSat to launch as well. So a lot of new countries, a lot of countries have things in the background they're working on to be able to launch satellites. Similarly, we saw a lot of activity in terms of ground infrastructure and general satellite infrastructure. So Ethiopia, for example, they commissioned a GNSS receiving station and magnetometer at the observatory. Kenya, in partnership with Italy, have been working to resume launching satellites from the Malindi Space Center that's kind of been dormant for the past few years. And then as well has been working on a liquid propellant rocket project through universities in Kenya. Namibia is working with Astrofika, so an African space company, and AAC Space Africa, to build nanosite ground stations and mission design facilities. South Africa recently inaugurated a new sounding rocket facility through the Aerospace Systems Research Institute, and they also launched actually two rockets successfully in December. And Zambia also commissioned a ground receiving station for Earth observation data and remote sensing. So just briefly, all of these things show us that there's a lot of activity going on the continent, especially when it comes to developing the necessary infrastructure to actually participate in a lot of the upstream technologies. So in terms of building and launching satellites, having the ground stations to speak to them, as well as focusing on the launch vehicles and trying to get the necessary launch capabilities. This is also a big topic in general, the launch capabilities. I mean, we saw that Djibouti wanted to set up a spaceport. This was the news a few years ago. Russia is currently actively looking for partners as well to take advantage of the equatorial orbit inclinations for launches. So generally, there's quite a lot of activity going on the infrastructure side. Now, there are a few interesting things that happened as well last year when it comes to regulation. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen probably the recent news in Kenya where there was a launch vehicle debris that fell in one of their counties. This is actually something that follows something that happened in Uganda in 2023. Actually, in Uganda, there was a debris from a SpaceX launch that fell in Western Uganda. So what we're seeing is that there's a lot more impacts from space activities that happen on Earth, especially when it comes to dual debris. And this is something that will remain of relevance in the future as we launch more and more satellites. And it's something that I think African countries need to also keep in mind when they are cooperating or collaborating with international partners to see if there's some mechanisms that can be put in place to offer more protection from debris, from space debris, and to also hold the operators of these vehicles and of these components liable for the damage that they cause on Earth. Of course, this is a much more complex topic in terms of international space law, so we'll see how easy it is to enforce or to participate in. But these are some of the things that have happened in the past that will probably gain more relevance looking forward to the future. This extends as well to Starlink. So we all know Starlink is expanding quite, Elon Musk's Starlink is expanding quite aggressively in Africa. But of course, it's also causing issues, right? So we heard last year as well that in Namibia, they issued a cease and desist to Starlink for providing services without a license. We heard similar stories, I think, in Nigeria and in other parts in Africa where Starlink is just moving without abandon. So this is also something that I think we should pay attention to, where we now have very large space players that are not necessarily tied to a specific country or nation, but private actors that are slowly, or rather quickly, actually gaining a lot more influence on the global arena and using that influence to push their own agenda forward. And so I think as Africa tries to get a greater seat at the table, we should also be aware that it's not just a seat of nations that are working, but there's also a lot of private actors that are now gaining more influence, and that will actually play a bigger role going forward in the modern space race. This is something I think that Africans also should pay attention to, and to try and also compete by backing a lot of the private activities within Africa and trying to stimulate a stronger private space sector within Africa, as that seems to be the more modern way of approaching space operations in general. Lastly, I'll just touch on a quick thing before I hand over, because I think I've already used quite a decent amount of time, and I'm sure we'll talk about things in a bit more detail in the discussion portion. But I did also want to touch on some aspects of education, because this is something that Spaces Africa we do as well. We focus on trying to provide different workshops, courses, or ways for people to gain more education within the space field. I know ASLI does the same thing. And so it's interesting to see that the University of Botswana, they last year launched a Center of Excellence in the for planetary and space science. And similarly, Senegal is actually collaborating with the Morocco-based African Regional Center for Space Science and Technology. So not that many activities in the education realm, but it's good to see that there's still advancements going on. I know the Pan-African University of Space Sciences is also expected to be inaugurated, I think, in the coming year. So overall, I would say things were quite positive last year. I mean, we saw developments in growing national space agencies, programs, satellites, and ground infrastructure. There were actually a decent amount of international collaborations, MOUs, strategic partners, countries like Russia, China, Europe, and the US. A lot of the applications within Africa are focusing on socio-economic applications and developments, which I think obviously is quite good for Africa. And slowly we're seeing a lot more private sector involvement, as well as the expected regulatory and licensing challenges. So I'll leave it at that for now. Just want to highlight a few things that we've been paying attention to in the past year, and that we'll be also monitoring in the coming year, to see sort of what the landscape looks like, how things are developing, and if there's really the momentum and traction that we want to see in the African space industry. But I'll close it off there for now and hand it back over to Etim, and I'm sure we'll continue this conversation throughout the course of this call.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Kwaku, for giving us that broad perspective. And I should also want to thank you at this point for the stuff you guys are doing at Space Ops Africa. Thanks a lot. I'll call on Tongwani now to share our own thoughts. So, you're muted, Tongwani.
Greetings, Etim.
Yeah, thank you.
Greetings to the leadership at the African Space Leadership Institute. Thank you to all of our stakeholders that have joined, both at on the continental level at the African Union, as well as our various governmental and commercial partners that are involved. I'm extraordinarily pleased to be here and to obviously look at the reflections of both the 2024 year in terms of space activities and developments, as well as looking forward into 2025 in terms of what we can expect. All right, so I'm from Space Commercial Services, or otherwise known as SES Space, which is a subsidiary spin-off of the SES Aerospace Group, coming out of South Africa, though operating with various institutions, as well as government to government, business and government to business, commercial activities that we're involved in on the African continent and globally. My role is I'm a director and Director for Commercialization, specifically around financing activities or outer space activities. And I look at the landscape in terms of the capabilities for us to be able to employ sustainable finance as well as commercial finance and project finance in funding space activities, both in South Africa, across the continent, and across the globe. The viewpoint that I come from at the moment is really from a commercial player in the space industry. And we have 35 plus years experience coming from developments or investments rather than human capacity development from both the South African government as well as across the continent. And we share quite a few insights in terms of the clients that we engage with around missions partners, around helping countries to build sustainable space programs, as well as to just highlight very briefly the space infrastructure that we're currently developing, which is both around the FleetSAR constellation, which is a synthetic aperture radar constellation being developed, designed. We're seeking to launch it and operate it in South Africa for both the African continent and for a global market. In terms of space activities, particularly in the commercial sector, we do note with some of the interactions that we have that commercial space companies are still highly concentrated within the South African jurisdiction, particularly within the Western Cape and Gauteng regions, where there have been quite a few developments around aerospace in the aviation sector, as well as linking that with some of the defense priorities. Though we have seen an increase in activities around companies that may have African heritage, however, aren't necessarily based in Africa. So that is looking at jurisdictions like North America, so a lot in the United States, some interest coming out of the Middle East. In terms of the interactions there, Europe, of course, is quite traditional. And though there has been, from a governmental perspective, platforms that are seeking to use the skills and expertise that you find in the commercial space, we're finding that increasingly it is coming from linkages, for example, in Europe. I won't necessarily mention the names because I'm not looking at doing levels of marketing for some of these companies, though the activities are certainly there. The increase is more in the satellite development, and we note, being quite pleased as well, that there's a request for there to be skills transfer and human capacity development. So where private companies are then securing contracts with governmental organizations, Nkwaku has mentioned just some of the contracting that is happening from a private space sector and commercial sector with government is an example of which we're seeing in Namibia, a company called Astrofika, which deals specifically with satellite engineering around, even though their assembly and integration facilities are quite developed. We're seeing some interesting news coming out of Nigeria, where there's a quasi-commercial and a private sector organization that was contracted to develop between 3 to 4 satellites for the Nigerian Space Agency. And the focus on that would be partially governmental. So these are national security concerns, as well as developing capability from a socio-economic application and economic applications around the areas of Earth observation and the ability to gain data for agricultural purposes, as well as some critical infrastructure monitoring. More in the telecom space, you then find the partnerships and collaborations, such as occurring in Rwanda. And although they haven't launched any additional satellites at the moment, there is a commercial company from France operating in the country and looking at how they are then collaborating to ensure that the Rwandan government is able to sustainably gain data for the various applications in government. And I need to move on to talking more about governmental collaborations. We're still finding quite a few governments still heavily relying on foreign-based internet suppliers. Rather foreign-based suppliers of satellite data, whether that be in the telecommunication space or that be according to Earth observation. If I could just quickly segue into what are some of the requirements that we saw coming out of the African space policy as well as the African space strategy, and those were highlighted being requirements around data to assist with infrastructure development. So how do you get data from satellites that are able to give you type of mapping and use by development agencies? Agriculture is really a large one. We're looking at governments really wanting to utilize satellite data through crop development, increasing crop yields, and these are some of the applications that are being used at the moment. Lastly, we have heard several years ago about discussions that are being had in various verticals or additional verticals in the space sector, which is just outside of satellites, and I believe is quite exciting, around the development of additional support and infrastructure with ground and what we call terrestrial infrastructure, and specifically for space transportation. So this is information that's coming out in reference to studies that are being done with spaceports and the identification of various ground infrastructure in terms of geographical placing with some African countries. This does stem, of course, with some of the successful projects that have come out of South Africa, like the Square Kilometre Array, and us demonstrating to quite a successful degree that there is the capability to develop really sustainable space infrastructure. Further, rather and up north in Egypt, besides launching the African Space Agency headquarters, there has been some discussions as well as looking at human space flight, and human space flight being around developing programs which would finally have the capability to have African, bona fide African astronauts heading up to the International Space Station, and also just being involved in development efforts. I'm looking forward to really just exploring these additional verticals quite extensively. I believe that we are cusped at the moment to find a situation where Africa moves beyond playing a catch-up or just a follow-up game in terms of satellite infrastructure and development because of the capabilities that are available in the world at the moment, and utilizing technology to seriously leapfrog ahead in terms of our capability with developments. And that would be, in terms of a case study, we put forward like the International Lunar Space Research base that has been signed between South Africa, cooperation agreement that has been signed between South Africa, the South African Space Agency, as well as the Chinese Space Agency to cooperate in activities on the moon. So it is quite exciting. I'm looking forward to hearing from the rest of the panelists, and I'm really looking forward to engaging on how we can really have these advanced, what we'll call advanced conversations around Africa's role as well as her voice in space. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tangwane. Very insightful also. Mishak, can I call on you now?
Yes, can you hear me?
Very well, yes.
Okay, so Happy New Year to you all, and thanks to you, a team, for convening us in this event of, I think it's the first event that we are convening for the start of 2025. And I also want to acknowledge all the participants that are participating in this call, and all the panelists that have given a lot of insights, and we are sharing a lot of insights that happen in 2024. So my name is Meshak, again with the African Union Commission, leading the capacity development in emerging and space technologies, and mostly on Earth observation, but also looking into other disciplines like navigation, positioning, as well as satellite communication. Well, I think the year 2024 has been very busy in terms of space activities and a lot of engagement, both at the national, regional and continental, as well as, global levels. And I want to thank all the colleagues that have highlighted a lot of verticals especially when it comes to the commercial sector. And I think now, when it comes to the government interaction or institutional setting, as you all know, the African Space Agency has been successfully set up in Egypt, which is the administrative headquarters for the agency, and working with all the 55 member countries of African Union to implement different activities. So the main role for the African Space Agency is to harness the space capabilities and to ensure there is coordination, and as well as to implement some joint missions and collaborative actions on space, what we call, the space programs, as they are going to be defined. We're currently looking at operationalization. It's not yet fully operational in terms of the human capacity, but you might have known or read in the news that we established the African Space Council, which is the supreme body to oversee the agency. And then afterwards, we look at the day-to-day operationalization, starting with the hiring of the Director General and then all the staffing that come with the programs. So guided by the policy and the strategy, we're looking at the four main domains as we know them. They have Earth observation, satellite communication, navigation and positioning and timing, as well as astronomy and space sciences. But then there are cross-cutting areas that have been defined as well: business development, then infrastructure and research and development, which are core to the building up of the space agency. So I hope that you'll be in the lookout to see the main developments. This year, we are hoping for, operationalization as well as, programmatic progress in different domains. I think in terms of collaboration within the continent, yes, we have seen a lot of increase in collaboration. And what we have learned is that, the regional the regional economic blocks of the continent, I'm talking about ECOWAS, institutions like ECOWAS, IGAD, EAC, SADC, and so on. We have seen a lot of, these institutions coming together to define their own regional space programs, which is a good aspect in terms of building the whole continental space program. And discussions have been ongoing. For ECOWAS is quite advanced, and I think SADC started the discussions recently of coalescing the Southern African development satellite or space program. And then there are discussions that have been ongoing within the East African region on how to come up with a regional space program within the East African region. And all these are building blocks, like I said, to the continental space program or the African Space Agency. So we in fact need them to be operational so that they can give the momentum to the Continental Space Agency. In terms of intergovernmental relations within the continent, yes, we have seen a lot of efforts that have been put for governments to interact, and I highlight here the initiative that Egypt started back a few years ago of about 5 countries coming up together to build a constellation, or at least satellite program, which is currently ongoing, and these are initiated by member countries of the African Union, which highlights that there are gaps and there are needs for intra-continental collaboration when it comes to the development of space programs. And we see that, it's building onto the steps of what we call the ARMC, or the African Resource Mobilization or Resource Monitoring Constellation, that was that was initiated like a decade ago. So there is still a lot of demand for intra-African collaboration when it comes to the development of programs, not only on the data segment, but also on the infrastructure segment. It has been highlighted here that also 2024 has been actively countries have been active in African context to establish, ground stations and as a service, and we have seen, countries revamping their efforts to, establish the launching capabilities as well as, using the ground stations for sharing. We have seen infrastructure development like the AIT infrastructure. Countries like, Egypt, Ethiopia, and South Africa have been very active on finalizing their, infrastructure for AIT. And I think, yes, there's a lot of, outside the continent, collaboration between the continent and the outside or the rest of the world. We have seen a lot of presence on the African and Europe collaboration in space, which have mostly measured on the data segment, which is the increase of the value. And Earth observation has been highlighted a lot in this because of the obvious value that it brings. In fact, it was projected that if we use or utilize the Earth observation data fully, we can unlock a $2 billion economy within every year on space data and space services only in Earth observation. And these are things like mining in terms of monitoring the environment, agriculture, which has been highlighted, and as we know, agriculture is the backbone of the African economy. So if we put to the utilization all the data coming from not only the external, the data coming from the external players like Copernicus and Landsat and many others, but also the data coming from the African satellites that have been launched. We are talking about almost 60 satellites that have been launched by the African countries, and if you look at the statistics, about 3/4 of them are for Earth observation. Again, it highlights that Earth observation still remains a great value for the continent, and it's tied to the sectors that the continent relies on: agriculture, environment, management of resources, and so on. So if we look at all these efforts that have been happening, the European and African collaboration has been highlighted mostly because of the investment that come through programs like GMES in Africa, which relies on the Copernicus infrastructure to increase the value or to add value to the management of natural resources, water resources, as well as marine and coastal areas and disaster management. We have had a successful 2024 with GMS in Africa in terms of human capital development. We have trained thousands of scientists in the utilization and combination of different technologies to derive more useful services from the Earth observation services. We have also worked in the area of infrastructure and data, ensuring that the Copernicus data and other data sets are available and made accessible to institutions that especially do research and development, but also moving beyond research and development to develop mature services. We have seen a lot of interaction between different technologies like cloud computing, which is in the IT side, and Earth observation, which is purely on the space side. So I think in the coming years, what we expect to see is the convergence of all these technologies to enhance the services that need to reach the people. I think what we have seen based on the judgment from all these projects is that mobile phones have been a key focus for many of these services. We're seeing institutions and private companies now putting all their efforts to develop services that can be unlocked through the mobile devices. And it's not only the smart devices for the not all or it's not all the population on the continent that have access to smart devices. We still have the use of USSD codes in lieu of the mobile application. So we have seen use cases like in the University of Ghana on the western coast that have used both the mobile application for smart devices, but also USSD code for communication between the fishermen community and the service providers to, for example, give 3-day weather forecast on the ocean conditions, and this has saved lives. So we have seen the main to reach the last mile within the continent. It's important for all the service providers that seek to have an end-to-end cycle with their services to incorporate or think about developing services on and reaching the masses using the mobile, especially the mobile phone and other devices. We expect to see more in 2025, a lot of moving beyond Earth observation to other areas. I know there have been a lot of activities again with the European and African countries, the European Union and the African Union on the GNSS side, which is the navigation, positioning, and timing services, particularly to expand what we call the satellite-based augmentation system using their Galileo platform. And we have seen a lot of engagement now to enhance this sector. There's a collaboration that has been signed already for the GNSS services, enhancing the Galileo and within the African context by both commission, by the European Union and ASECNA. We know that this will also bring a lot of interaction between different technologies, and I think it's something that we need to look out for and to track the measurement of performance in all these aspects that are coming up. Going beyond that, we also saw a lot of disruption in 2024. It started in 2023, yes, coming through 2024 on the satellite communication. Again, there is interaction between or collaboration between Europe and Africa on the IRIS Squared, which is an initiative that is coalescing all the efforts in Europe to develop a master, communication system that provides secure communication. It's based on low Earth and the traditional geo satellite communication, and it's seeking to enhance or to expand to the continent within the coming few years. I think starting in 2025, we'll see the test and the the proof of concept and then the operationalization. Someone mentioned that there is also 2024 has seen about 16 countries or thereabout licensing the Starlink constellation within the continent, which again entails the fact that people are moving from there's a lot of demand not only on the traditional Earth observation, but services are now going into GNSS services and satellite communication. It's something that we need to pay attention to, even as we build the African Space Agency. It's very important that we also come together as a continent to see how we can provide services for ourselves and the end-to-end solution that the African population is waiting for to improve their life conditions. And we hope that the African Space Agency, working with the national space agencies as well as the regional space organizations, will be able to reach this milestone. But it also calls for the industry to come together in collaboration. So I think the main point here is that as the governments collaborate, also the private sector within the continent needs that kind of collaboration and cross-sectoral collaboration to enhance the services that we need on the continent. So let me stop here and then get into the discussions later. I thank you, Tim.
Thanks a lot, Mishak. Thanks a lot. You covered quite a lot, and you're already looking into the 2025 kind of outlook. Next but not the least, Samuel, if I may call on you now. Thanks for your patience.
Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, thanks so much for inviting me to join the panel. I'd like to appreciate the other panelists for some of the insightful information and discussion that we have had so far. It's quite challenging to be the last speaker because sometimes most of the issues are already covered and then you just need to chip in a few things here and there. So many things have been covered already. Some of the basic information about 2024 space program in Africa have been covered. Issue of commercialization, education, as well as details about the technicalities, the technological innovation and development in across Africa in the last year are already covered. But let me just chip in a few things why my focus will mainly be around the politics, the space politics that we witnessed in 2024. However, before going into the politics, on the commercialization, already the first, second, and the third speaker have identified some of the issue around commercialization of space in Africa. Just to identify as well, buttress one of the issue or cases that were raised earlier by the second speaker. The collaboration between Nigeria and Proforce is an example of what we may see as emerging trend in Africa, because Proforce is a military industry or firm in Nigeria which produce ammo tank, ammo personnel carrier, and some other equipment for the military and the police. It has been the company has been involved in a number of other projects with the Air Force, and now the agreement signed between Proforce and the Space Agency shows growing collaboration and efforts, collaboration between the civil, military, and then commercial space agency in the country. Having this in back of our mind that Nigeria also have a military space program. This is another area that is growing across Africa. The military dimension of space program, which we have not touched much, talked more about in the discussion earlier. There are a few African countries that have developed military space program, and that include Egypt, South Africa, Algeria, Nigeria, and Morocco. These African countries have displayed certain capability and interest in military dimension of space. As we see, South Africa was the first country to launch a military satellite. A radar satellite was launched in 2014. And then Egypt has launched a dual-use satellite for telecommunication. Nigeria launched its military satellite in 2003, in 2023, and then the military has rolled out certain plan in terms of using this satellite and some other for supporting counter-insurgency, counter-banditry, and some other national security threats. And connecting this to politics, because security is in the context of politics. We see recently a trend of Russia agreement with the Sahelian states to build 3 satellites for Mali, Burkina Faso, and then Niger. These are countries that have their domestic and regional security threats, including transnational crime, armed banditry, as well as Islamist insurgency of Boko Haram and some other terrorist group in the region. So in the light of these are national security threats to this country. However, in the context of politics, it's also worrisome that although we have this growing sense of cooperation across Africa, we also have certain undisclosed competition on the continent. especially we look at the realist opinion of safety for one may amount to a certain feeling of insecurity by some countries around that country. And that's what happened between Egypt and Ethiopia during the with the issue of Nile River clashes and the recent issue with Somaliland. Ethiopia attempt to gain foothold at the sea. All these have connection back to space program as well, because this country are also building their capability in space, and space is also becoming relevant to their military and strategic planning. So the politics around the space in the continent cannot be ignored. Morocco and Algeria are neighbors with some level of animosity, and issue of this Western Sahara is a major issue between Morocco and Algeria. And this also have implication for their space program. And that's why recent rapid involvement of Morocco space program is also a response to Algeria's space program. Although space race is a concept that I'm not too convenient in using while describing space program in Africa, but there are certain indicators that are showing that there are certain response to certain activities in other parts of the country, the continent, that mirror what we know as space race. Although that concept is not too good for the kind of unity and aspiration that we want for the continent, where the continent needs to work together to promote collaboration and work together, as we have heard from the third speaker. So other dimension of competition that I'm also concerned about, that attracted my attention, is great power intervention in the continent. We have seen a number of great power like US, China, Russia, and France, and the rest of them taking interest in African space program. And this competition among them is most evident when we consider issue of space exploration, especially manned mission and more program recently. A number of African countries have signed to the International Lunar Space Program of China. That includes South Africa and Egypt in 2023. In 2024, we see Ethiopia and Senegal signing up to this. Meanwhile, for US Artemis Accord has received the support of Angola, Nigeria, and Rwanda. So these are issues that shows orientation to different pattern of global leadership in terms of space. These may look irrelevant for now, but the competition between the US and China in space may snowball to more overt race, which may also have implication for African countries in the long run. So generally, African cooperation and a pattern of cooperation with outside world have a significant geopolitical implication. As we can see in the last year, that's in 2024, African launched 4 satellites, and these 4 satellites, 2 were launched from the US, 1 from Russia, and another one from China. And in time of collaboration in building satellite, we noticed that France was involved with Senegal's satellite, while Germany was involved in on that satellite. Compared to 2023, where China was involved in building 2 of, in collaborating in building 2 of African satellites that was launched out of the 7, and was involved in 3 launch service for Africa, compared to the US that was not really been involved in building African satellites, but has been involved in launching African satellites. US was involved in launching 4 satellites for Africa in 2023. And Bulgaria is another country that is making inroad into the continent, especially through Djibouti and a few other countries. These are countries that are not too big in time of their consideration of global power arrangements, but they are making inroad into Africa. In the area of security, I think the second or the first speaker mentioned issue of space debris. This is another area that African countries need to pay attention to in collaborating with other countries or like-minded countries across the world to set rules and to monitor and see to how these rules are implemented and convince other countries to buy into this rule, especially now that more great power are taking interest in Africa. As we can see, China has signed agreement with Djibouti to build a launch pad in Djibouti. This will have more implication in time of debris of launch services from that part of the continent. And these are the reason why we need to have more coherent policy framework and African position to address emerging challenges of this nature. Other area of security that this space is more concerned about is in the issue of land-based security or issue of military dimension. More African countries are confronting complex asymmetric challenges, as we can see in DRC Congo, in Ethiopia, in Egypt. Libya is still confronting its internal security challenges. Maritime security concern is another thing for many African countries. And these are areas where satellite can actually help out in time of gathering real-time data and intelligence reconnaissance to support military decision and security policy. And in this consideration, I think it's only South Africa that have managed to launch a constellation of 3 satellites for maritime situation domain awareness. I think Africa will do better by working together in many areas. We consider some of these satellites in their time of passing by. Some of them pass by in 1 in 2 days or 3 days. Some of them across that country of interest, or some once in a day or twice in a day, and so on. So working together make it easier for Africans to share data, and I think the African Union can do more. African Space Agency can do more in facilitating information sharing among African countries. So I think I'll wait for question and answer time so that I can shed more light on this. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Samuel, for bringing this the military perspective and the political perspective. Sometimes many of us don't always know. I mean, don't look at it that side of things. We just focus more on the infrastructure, satellite, the applications. These other implications, both locally and externally, are usually things that we need to consider. So thanks a lot. Okay, maybe I just see whether I can throw maybe a round of questions before I open up to the audience. But I start with you again, Kwaku. You spoke a lot about on several things: infrastructure, regulations, space education, and other things. Let me just ask a question around infrastructure. Thanks for the analysis which you gave about the number of countries that have launched satellites, and like you mentioned, virtually all, I think, all the satellites are small satellites, and the satellites are oftentimes they are developed outside, so they are procured, so developed from outside. I don't know, maybe you want to speak about the local capability of these countries, or generally in Africa, about developing satellites locally. And then he also talked about the decreasing trend over the years in terms of number of satellites that are launched. What could be the reasons for this decreasing trend, and what is the likely impact on the African space economy? Kwaku.
Thanks for your questions, Etim. So to address the first one in terms of developing satellites locally, so as far as I'm aware, there are only plans currently in Egypt and in South Africa to develop satellite manufacturing facilities. So I know that in Egypt, I believe they're working with the Chinese to develop their own facilities, and that's a big project of theirs for this year and going forward, to have a large satellite manufacturing assembly within Egypt so that we can really start to produce a lot of satellites locally. Now, I think South Africa has similar plans, and I believe Nigeria also has similar plans. But indeed, this is something that I think is relevant and important for African countries to focus on. right? So we talk a lot about the satellites that have been launched and like how good it is for Africa to be finally participating in these global space race. But in fact, most of the satellites that have been launched have been manufactured, produced, designed by foreign partners, simply put. I mean, I know, especially with, like, for example, a lot of the CubeSats through the CubeOQ program have a lot of supports. A lot of the bird satellites, so like, for example, the GhanaSat-1 that was launched in, I think, 2017, was supported by Japanese universities as well. So as it stands right now, African countries still rely largely on foreign partners to be able to produce and launch satellites. And this is something that I hope with the launch of the satellite manufacturing facilities on the continent will encourage African countries to work together. So I mean, I think this ties in a bit to what Meshach mentioned in his talk, which is that we're starting to see a lot more activities on the regional level. So I think Meshach was talking a lot about how SADC, ECOWAS, the Eastern African Community, and other similar communities have been building regional space programs. And I think this is actually something that needs to be strengthened and really focused on. So a few years ago in 2023, I wrote sort of an article looking at the African Space Agency and what it could be used for, or sort of how it could be used to its greatest effect. And one thing I did mention was thinking of a structure that's not just fully dependent on the African Space Agency on the continental level to drive everything, but you think more decentralized and more in layers. So we have the continental layer, with the regional layer, with the local layer, and each layer really has to drive efforts forward if we really want to have a holistic and a complete system, right? So it's good already to hear that there are regional economic communities which are really working on this. But I think we can take it a step further where these RECs could actually, push for more infrastructure in terms of being able to develop and build and develop satellites from start to finish on the continent, right? These could also be viewed as regional initiatives to enable participation also from the smaller countries within Africa. But overall, I think there needs to be a push for African countries to really start working with each other rather than looking to foreign partners to fulfill that need. Because I think we've reached a point where we can't say that there aren't any capable African countries or companies. There are a lot of them. And so it's about trying to really encourage them and support them and actually have them be sort of the drivers of African space ambitions. Now, this also ties in, I mean, the second question that you asked was sort of about the decreasing trends in satellites. Here, it's always a bit difficult to say, and I think it's a bit too early to call it a trend. I mean, sure, in the past 3 years, so like I mentioned, in 2023, there were 2022, sorry, there were 8 satellites launched, and then in 2023, 25, and this year 4. But if we look over a larger time period, what we see is that actually there was a big boom of satellites between sort of 2016 and 2019, where about, I think, 20-ish satellites were launched in that 3-year period, which then fell quite dramatically over COVID, where there's only 1 satellite launched in 2020 and then 3 in 2021. So if we try and think about it on a longer scale, we see that there was an initial boom in the 2016s to 2019s that fell off dramatically with COVID, and now sort of it's slowly trying to pick itself back up and become, and so we should be seeing more satellites being launched in the future. And as mentioned, there's been at least a lot of announcements from different countries within Africa that have the ambition and intention to build satellites, and not just one, but usually a constellation or at least several different satellites to have different effects. What I do think, though, is a reason why there has been not really a slowdown, but there has been sort of inconsistencies with the satellites launch, is because I think also a lot of African countries launch the satellites without necessarily having a clear plan of action in terms of how do we actually use this data within our country. Do we have the ground infrastructure and ground stations to actually even receive the data? I believe there was a story with Uganda, was it Uganda? I believe it was Uganda, which had launched the satellites some years ago, but in the end, the satellite basically went through its lifetime without even being accessed because there was a lot of delays in the construction of the ground station that was meant to talk to the satellites. So basically, you have a country that launches a satellite, but doesn't have the infrastructure to even talk to the satellites. And due to delays, funding, whatever local challenges, by the time they even reach a place where they might be able to continue the ground station development, the satellite's already reached its lifetime, and they kind of wasted all the funds behind developing and launching the satellite in the first place. So I think there has to be a clear sort of plan of action from countries that are launching satellites to really think not just through the, okay, we want to launch a satellite, get the like national prestige, the hype, build a bit of momentum, but okay, what comes after that, right? It's like everybody pays attention when the satellite is launched. We all see the rocket go, we all celebrate, but then what happens in the weeks, months, years after that? Is there a plan to actually use the satellites? Is there a plan to develop a constellation? How does this satellite tie into the greater ambitions of the country, right? And I think there are a lot of African countries which maybe didn't have a clear plan at the start, which probably impacts their ability then to motivate building and launching a new satellites to join whatever their efforts are. And I think that's something that needs to be sort of thought about a bit more in detail by African countries before they launch satellites. So I think there are a lot of competing things. I mean, one is like the purpose. Obviously, there's issues with costs and manufacturing, and there's a lot of different reasons why that delays satellite launches. And I do think overall that there will continue to be more launches. I do think countries are motivated to really become a bigger player in the industry. But it's certainly something that I think without having the proper plan behind, you'll see the momentum slow down and eventually stop. And then plans that you may have had to launch multiple satellites end up falling through in the end because you weren't able to sort of prove the use case to either the politicians or to the civilians within your country, who in the end you need your sort of participation or the interest and your support to really continue building satellites and continue being active in an industry that requires a lot of costs at the end of the day, right? Building and launching a satellite is a very expensive thing for a lot of African countries, and so to motivate that, you really need to show that you need to show that by launching this or by doing these activities, there is going to be a return to the country. And I think that's sort of a thing that's kind of missing for a lot of the newer nations that are launching satellites. Of course, countries that are established like Egypt, South Africa, it's easier for them to motivate the investments behind it because they have sort of a history of satellite technologies being used for socioeconomic development or for economic growth, which you don't have in the smaller countries. So this is sort of like a two-sided approach that needs to be sort of joined better to really see countries really put more money or put more funding behind actually building and launching their own satellites.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Kwaku, and thanks also for citing the issue that Uganda had with the small sat that was launched, I think, just through Japan. Unfortunately, there was no legal framework, I mean, locally that they could use, no policy and legal framework that was on ground. So it was virtually a loss for Uganda. There's a related question in the chat box, which I also wanted to quickly respond to. The question is from Ogoba. Has Africa used a model of fractional ownership of space infrastructure? But I'm going to reframe it a bit or maybe modify it, which is what are if you can talk about the pros and cons of how this fractional ownership, so, and not just for satellite infrastructure as a whole. So some countries focusing on developing AIT, some others focusing on developing ground stations, some others focusing on satellite itself. What are the pros and cons? And do you think it's, I mean, which one will you recommend? Maybe put it that way.
I mean, I think if you can motivate sort of a regional cooperation, there's a lot of pros behind it, right? Because you can have member states that are strong in one aspect, focus on that. You can have specialization and sort of trade between the regions to make sure that the system is mutually reinforcing and actually strong. The issue comes to that, I think also for Africa, if we're thinking about a regional model where, I don't know, like the Eastern African region all works together to build the infrastructure, is that it becomes very complicated very quickly when you start thinking about returns. Right, because if we're trying to have a fractional ownership, of course, some countries are going to have to invest more than others. So, for example, if let's say we're trying to build a spaceport in Eastern Africa, and now we have all the Eastern African countries fund it, there are going to be people who are funding more than others, right? So then the question becomes that, okay, if Ethiopia funds 90% of the spaceport, what returns do they get from it? Do they then, what's the licensing or the business model behind the spaceport? Do they then get a greater share of revenues from private operators that are using the spaceport? How is that actually distributed? Who actually manages these things? How do these components all fit together? The issue, of course, with fractional ownership is that you have a lot more stakeholders who all now want a piece of the pie, and trying to divide the returns is very difficult. I think a lot of people always look at the European Space Agency or like a European model to say, okay, well, it's very feasible for African countries to copy this model and work together and sort of have the same kind of economic return models and like the structure behind it. But I think a lot of people forget as well that the European model works the way it does because there are a lot of very strong nations from an industrial perspective who have the capabilities, who have, the professional workforce, who already had infrastructure, who already had fundings from different things that allows them to operate on a more equal level. This is something that is not necessarily as possible in Africa, because if we think about, Northwest, East, Southern Africa, there's always sort of one space champion, which is much more developed than the rest of the countries in that region. And so then to sort of put the onus on that regional power, for if it's in South Africa, if it's in Southern Africa, let's say South Africa, to drive and lift up all the other countries around them with them, it's a question for South Africa to think, hey, should we actually invest in the regional side, which will, we have a lower return, or do we just directly invest in our own space systems and our own space infrastructure and capture the full benefits of the revenue behind it, right? So I think that is it's an interesting model because I think it will allow participation from smaller nations. But I'm not sure if it's something that is really, really relevant for Africa, so to say, right? I think a big part of it for it to work would be to ensure that everyone has skin in the game. And so then you really have to think on a member state level to think, okay, what can these other countries really contribute? Do they have a certain specialization? Do they have access to certain materials? Do they have maybe just the right orbital inclination? You really have to break it down to really see what each country is offering. And in that way, it can actually add more complexity to the situation than you would think from the outset. But I think if the right situation is in place, if all the countries are really able to contribute something that the other country is not able to, if there's a regional leader that is willing to take on the burden of leading the entire region with them and sort of maybe sacrificing their own industry for the benefit of the region, I think it's possible. But I'm not necessarily sure that this is something, especially at this moment, that is relevant for African nations to think about.
Okay, thanks, Kwaku. Thanks a lot for your response. Tongwan, if I may come to you, and I want to ask you something around the commercial space sector angle. Like you mentioned, you may say that South Africa it's a focal point or a major spot where commercial space happens. Will you kindly speak about the viability of the commercial space companies? How profitable, how are they in terms of profitability, how are they doing? And then I know you also looked at some other countries like Nigeria. Can you also speak about how the formal commercial sector is coming up in other countries in Africa and other regions? The other aspect I just wanted to touch on has to do with the growth of the industry. So like I think you pointed out, many of the South African companies are expanding outside the African continent, not within the African continent, possibly because maybe they are getting more patronage from outside. So like Simera Spence going out, CubeSpace expanding outside. Speak about that trend also. What could be the impact on African commercial industry too as a whole?
Thank you, Etem. Well, I'd have to look at it from two perspectives. One is a purely business and purely commercial perspective, because ultimately, even though that we're speaking about space, the ultimate output is technology, which then gets exported, and this becomes a really commercially viable business model. And the other aspect has to do with development of markets, the maturation of markets, and the capability of markets to be able to absorb commercial industry, the whole entire ecosystem that is a participant within that commercial aspect. And lastly, what the various environments look like from a stakeholder engagement, both on governmental level and then on business level. To focus in terms of the business aspects, the South African commercial space industry, and particularly the supply chain, has been successful because it's benefited quite largely over the efforts around investment in both infrastructure and human capacity development that was undertaken by the South African government over an extended period of time. So the more publicly available information the investment
Is it just my internet or?
that
I think, Tongone,
in the early 1990s, mental to government backed out of space treaty. The model first within globally, where a company first has a contract from a governmental level, so becomes a prime contractor for a very large scale infrastructure investment around satellites, or if you're going to look from a ground segment perspective, in Denel, for example, and then being able to then grow that and spin that out into more commercial aspects. Then bringing that out and growing that business then to second tier, third tier, either and particular verticals, specifically around component manufacturing, the assembly integration and testing facilities, some of our radiation testing facilities and services. We've been quite successful. I suppose as a South African, I'm quite proud to say that we have companies in the supply chain that have sold in excess of components, around 2,000 missions, which are both on Earth and in low Earth orbit, in geo, in cislunar space, and excitingly enough, actually in lunar space as well. So there are South African components that are flying in lunar reconnaissance orbiters. From a profitability perspective, it is, I suppose, like any environment and any ecosystem that does rely on customers. So those customers are across government. I would also say quasi-government in the sense of speaking about agencies. I'm speaking about governmental agencies, and to a smaller extent, business to business, where you're finding components being sold to companies who are also participating quite largely themselves in the industry, but are looking at benefiting from different verticals. All right. So this develops, this then segments the industry into two, which is upstream. So upstream is focused on developing the actual infrastructure that is required. So that's your ground segment, your terrestrial infrastructure, and also the space infrastructure that's required. In terms of profitability, it's interesting. It's an interesting metric to track, because while companies have developed quite successfully, and we'll speak about a dollar denomination in terms of them financially being viable. There are quite a few companies that have been extremely and largely successful financially, while some that are focused on other verticals, relying extensively on government contracting, are still here, are still sustainable, are still viable. However, haven't necessarily been able to really grasp the capability and the market availability. And I will blame this largely on foreign competitors, where there is this tendency of African countries, just generally largely across the continent, to choose to participate with other global countries or international countries, as well as from seeking the capabilities that are available in the supply chain within the African market, right? And to this end, bringing back to strategic infrastructure on large scale development, we're looking at South Africa's Space Infrastructure Hub, which was started, of course, proposed by the South African National Space Agency, and was a strategic and is a strategic project in terms of infrastructure development with the Office of the Presidency. And this was meant to then look at the agenda on how that level of infrastructure could in fact be beneficial to the rest of the continent in terms of facilities, in terms of human capacity development. And I in particular chaired a stream around the Pan-African agenda, and the Pan-African agenda was to bring through stakeholders both in the commercial market, fully private sector, who don't have a stake at all in terms of your defense capabilities or your security requirements, but are looking purely at the commercial industry and bringing through governments to have a look at market development across the continent. There are some exciting sprouts that come out of that, and that is some of the larger economies. Obviously Egypt, Nigeria. It's more interesting to note that Egypt does have a larger contingency or cohort of private companies. Nigeria is extremely nascent with that, and you would expect with its level of economic development that the market would be a lot more open. Though how and the feedback that came through from the supply chain and from private companies was that it's still very challenging to do business in the African market. And so you sit with this juxtaposition, you sit with this very interesting dynamic where international companies are in essence obtaining components as well as various products within the African supply chain, and are utilizing those very same products to actually sell back where Africa and the African continent is a customer. This doesn't necessarily play out the same when we look at data products, which is the downstream market. There is slightly a bit more of adoption that is happening in that stream. Just from an outlook perspective, I would say it is a profitable business. There are profitable business models that are currently occurring, but it is going to be really important if we're going to take advantage and develop markets that Africa does develop effectively in terms of its ecosystem.
Thanks a lot. One of the aspects I also asked was the expansion outside. What impact does it have on the African industry?
What we are finding is that generally companies are moving to economic environments which are a lot more financially viable and economically beneficial. The fight, in essence, is how to keep the technology within I'll say particularly from a regional perspective in the South African environment, and ensure that we don't get necessarily cannibalized by those markets where you'll find a disproportionate term in terms of earnings, them earning a lot more in European and North American, even largely Middle Eastern environments. There's a lot that's coming through from that region, and still maintaining what is called the effective place of management within South Africa, so that we retain that IP, we retain that skills and expertise. That being said, though, we're being courted. We're being courted left, right, and center. The International Finance Corporation, of course, backed by as an institution of the World Bank, has made quite a landmark investment in a South African company. You've mentioned Samara Space, which deals specifically around high definition cameras that are operational in space. I mean, it's absolutely unprecedented. We're seeing quite a high level of investment coming through into companies that are coming with conditions to state that you need to have another operational environment. So Belgium, America, well, in terms of the United States, and as I said, interesting enough, there's quite an interesting bit of competition that's happening between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as well as the United Arab Emirates, who aren't shy to state that, well, we want this intellectual property, we want the product, we want the skills development, and we want you to actually develop it in terms of indigenization strategy within our country. So if you're having to look at a project finance perspective or look at a sustainability perspective, it's a question of now which are the jurisdictions that you choose, and that which gives you a far more suitable and conducive economic operating environment, or that which you from a forecast perspective has a little bit of challenges in terms of how economically viable it would be for the company moving forward. I hope that's comprehensive.
Very, very, very. Thanks a lot for your thought. There's another question in the chat box which has a commercial angle, which I was want to pose to you from Maren. Given the global rise of ground station as a service, as a service, space business model, is there any significant activity or development related to this business model within the continent?
Very, very insightful question. Thank you to whoever in the audience sent that through. I absolutely love this because we start now having the discussion around the intersection of the developments, high-speed developments in technology, and how that actually starts playing out from a pragmatic and a really practical aspect with rolling out infrastructure. So well, just for our audience, I mean, a ground station as a service relies on technology to provide the type of services that you would have in terms of operating and managing satellite operations, as well as, excitingly enough, space missions. And where traditionally you would have had to invest quite substantially in civil works, this is literally brick and mortar type of ground stations, there are capabilities now in terms of offering this as a service from a technological perspective. If I could just segue very quickly, I mean, we were approached several years ago, I'd say 2017, 2018, by quite a large global tech company that was looking at moving into the space. And interestingly enough, they were looking, well, to speak to us or to have that discussion around how they could move into the continent. And one of the looking at specifically the SKA co-location project, which is a conglomeration of about 8 different countries. The largest question that we got from a business model perspective is that as much as you're offering the service, and as much as from a technological perspective, it does what it needs to do, there were quite a few security questions that started coming up around where the cloud infrastructure is sitting, where the cloud architecture is, where the data would be sitting in terms of particularly data centers, and also in terms of jurisdictions. So if you're looking at a company that's based out of North America, what are some of the security concerns around privacy and data? And this is quite an advanced conversation that's happening on the African continent around data sovereignty. So countries want to have the capability from a control perspective to be able to gather, put together, store, and utilize their data the way that they see fit without having the specter of security and privacy issues coming into play. So ultimately, just to swing back, the model has the capability to be successful, although what is important is that when customers look at issues around security, privacy, what's happening with their data, whether their data is getting fed to large language models like AI, for example, just some of those parameters, they really want to play. They really want to play a larger role, which I find is quite impressive. So that is currently what is an impediment to that particular service model on the African continent, and I believe in some other jurisdictions as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Let me, Shak, if I may come to you now, and my question has to do with, especially as your role at the African Union, at the African Space Agency, which from the African Space Policy and Strategy, it's supposed to kind of coordinate activities, as you mentioned, and also grow the sector, grow the industry. So going back to the documents, there are 4 thematic priority areas: Earth observation, satellite communication, navigation and positioning, and astronomy. And I just wanted to share a sense of how the African Union or the African Space Agency is developing each of these sectors and the industry as a whole. When you were speaking, you talked about GMES and Africa. How, for example, how does that program, the companies, the local companies and institutions that are being engaged, how do they, do I use the word, internalize the knowledge and technologies that are being developed, so that even if tomorrow, definitely at some time, at some point, the program will end, the European funding will end, how the sustainability of those initiatives that have come up. That's on Earth observation. And then you also talked about ARMC. How is the African Union also trying to ensure that that initiative, which has been on for a couple of years, moribund, nothing much happening in the angle, is revived and becomes kind of an active initiative too. On satellite communication, you mentioned IRIS², which is an initiative of Europe, which again, just like GMES and Africa, will be extended to Africa too. But it appears there are also some issues around IRIS². In the news, there was this issue of Italy having an engagement with Starlink, and the security concerns that came with that. Should we have such security concerns when it comes to IRIS²? Are we not supposed to try to develop our own industry capabilities like RASCOM and some other satellite communication companies within Africa? On navigation and positioning, the group that works with ASECNA, which you mentioned, I think they have a project called ANGA. Do you have any idea of the status of that project? And then finally, on astronomy, even though the African Union does not speak much about astronomy, I don't know, this year, last year, for the very first time, the IAU held its General Assembly in Africa for the first time, and we are hoping that that is going to kind of stimulate astronomy development in Africa. What do we expect from the African Union on that too? So just on those priority areas.
Thanks, team, and all the colleagues that have spoken before. I think it actually ties to the previous speakers and all that has been discussed in the past. That yes, we are focusing on the 4 main domains, which is Earth observation, navigation, positioning. We have SATCOM, and then astronomy and space sciences. But all these technologies, in my view, they are actually not isolated. They exist in convergence, and to have a broader service or service that has impact on the community, you have to somehow involve all these technologies together. And I give you an example of, if you want to develop a service that has to do with, and I mentioned one that we are running under GMS in Africa, in the Western Africa, with the University of Ghana, in which we inform the fishermen community or the fisher community on the weather conditions in the sea, and give them like 1 week or 3 days heads up on how it's going to be. So we involve the telecom in a sense that the telecom operators are involved to be able to do a service on a mobile application or USSD code. Then you also have the geolocation of that particular zoning, and then you have the other observation, which now tops up the main service. So you're working with at least 4 or 5 technologies all together to derive a service. So they don't really have a boundary to say. We have been seeing a lot of convergence in the past, and I think this is the direction that space is heading. And I also tie this, even though it's not in your question, that yes, we find a lot of existence in silos with the space community, which is really limiting us in terms of how we can expand to broader services or sustainability. Space in itself actually doesn't have so much money to trade within itself. So you find that, and I thank Dr. Gwane for bringing that up. Yes, there is interaction between selling and buying of components amongst the space community, but if you look at it in a broader perspective, your money will not come from the space community. You're looking at the sectorial activities, like, let's say, agriculture, or sectors like blue economy that will bring in the money to space. But we haven't done a lot of that attraction in those sectors to bring in the money to the space domain. And probably one of the reasons is that the bankability of the projects. So if we do in silos, each country launches their own program and they exist on their own, we are only going to achieve so much compared to when we work together and approach development agencies or sectorial agencies or sectorial ministries to get that money. So yes, our perspective is to start from the project view. You definitely need those kickstarters, like a flagship project that will highlight the main services that you want for the continent. And this is what we have been doing in GMS in Africa. It's a project, yes, it has a lifetime, and it has its own limitations of resources, but using that to catalyze the ecosystem. So like when we were designing the grants process, we ensured that at least we bring in the African industry, even though it's in the nascent stage, and we have seen a lot of growth on the industry that is providing services, end-to-end services, or a particular sector. At least 20% of the grants that go to institutions are reserved for the private sector and to grow the industry. And we have seen a lot of growth of a lot of companies have come up on the EO side, and not only on the EO side, even beyond the space community. I also want to say this, that space itself relies on many other factors and sectors. In fact, to have a driving ecosystem of space, it relies on the other domains like IT. It relies on the infrastructural development, and I want to highlight here that even though we are talking more of leapfrogging, but you understand that there is some leapfrogging that we cannot leapfrog all the steps in the industrial development. Right now, we are struggling with the fourth industrial revolution because of the fact that we probably leapfrogged a lot in terms of the three other industrial development, and there is that gap that we cannot deny in space, because on the continent in terms of space, because we don't have the underlying industrial development that is needed to kickstart the space. We have champion countries like Egypt, for example, or South Africa, that is relying on that test bed of other industries to build their space capability, which needs also to be replicated in many other countries. But the majority of the countries that we see, that level of industrial development is not there. So we cannot we cannot run away from the fact that we need to work together. The African continent, the African countries that have the capabilities to open up and work with other countries, and to allow that interaction between the different sectors and the different segments, the ground stations and the idea of ground station as a model would probably thrive on the African continent more, because that's where you have a lot of gaps. And I wish that we can come up with a business case. And even though it's not a sole responsibility of the African Space Agency, this is it requires all hands on deck from the private sector, from the government perspective, to really open up to work together and develop these capabilities. We are supposed to, as an agency, to oversee, to come up with flagship programs in these domains. But like I said, we're going to see a lot of interaction across the different sectors. The different ones that you have highlighted, like ANGA and IRIS Squared, we see them as kickstarters again to help us build on sustainable, programs or flagship programs that can be considered as continental flagships. But at the moment, because the agency is new, and we are also developing, some of these technologies and capabilities. Our perspective is to use the projects like ANGA and IRIS Squared to test some, appetite for these services, and then beyond that, we should have now indigenous programs that should be able to sustain themselves beyond the project, and this all comes down to money and investment. So again, we cannot exist in silo in terms of regional perspective. Africa cannot exist on itself or on its own. We do need to interact with the global players, like the European and US and the Middle East, etc. But what needs to happen is to find our own niche in all these market segments. So that's what I can say for now. I hope I have answered your question, Tim.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And the money and investment issue by African countries is a discussion maybe we'll need to have another time, because that's a big issue. There's a question in the chat box around G20, and that's Mishak, I still want to address that to you. Now that the African Union is a member of G20, and coincidentally, South Africa also is chairing the G20 at this time. So the question is, what key messages does Africa's space community need to put forward at the G20? And Mishak, I'm also aware that you've attended some of the meetings, like the Space Economy Leaders Meeting. What is the vision? What's the aspiration in terms of the impact of G20 in trying to grow the African space economy? As you speak on G20, there's also the World Economic Forum. The meeting is coming up, I think, within the next 2 weeks, either next week or so. Also, what are we bringing forward there too? Because space is a major component in that program now.
Thanks, Tim. G20 is really a platform where you interact with the global players. But I participated mostly on the research and innovation, which we the main agenda for Brazil as the chair of last G20 was pushing on the agenda of the open innovation concept. It's open science and open innovation across different sectors. And I'm glad that South Africa has taken up the chairmanship, because now we do have so there are different working groups in the G20, and I mean, research and innovation is just one of them. But the space community in the G20 have also come together to form the Space Economy Leaders Forum, which is trying to transition into a full working group. And this is where we found a lot of meaning in terms of being within the G20 community. There are many other political agendas and many other working groups that are dealing with the economy, the AI, and the politics of it. But for the research and innovation and the Space Leaders Economy meeting, which is hopefully it will be transitioned into a full working group, one of the key outcomes was that we do need there's a program that was proposed by India around climate change, that all the space community within the G20 needs to come together to tackle climate change and offer full services for the towards the measurement and the predictions on the climate change and how we can mitigate that. But everyone, of course, has to bring something to the table. And South Africa has been experienced or has a lot of experience in the G20, having participated for many years. And I think we are the new comers on the table, and we hope to also participate with our own, expertise, not only in providing the satellite data. There's always a part that Africa can play, and I like, the fact that we have had a lot of expertise, a lot of missions that are happening in space are actually, if you look around, many of them have African participation, either in terms of expertise, in terms of components, like Tongwane mentioned that there are some instruments flying on the moon and elsewhere. And African expertise or human capital has been very instrumental in all of them. And we have a lot of African climate scientists that have been used in the modeling and providing a lot of insights into their climate change mitigation measures and adaptation, which have formed, the core of the whole climate change discussion and outputs. And I think this is one component that we can bring to the table in terms of the expertise and the skill set. We foresee that if this is sustained or able to go beyond this, and if there is a proposed, let's say, a flagship program or a joint mission that is dedicated to climate change, there is no reason why Africa should not participate in one way or the other, either in component or building up the program itself. And I think this is something that we await for the South African leadership to see whether it's going to be sustained and which form it will take. It was proposed by India, and I hope that it can be sustained. For the whole of, for the research and innovation, I think the concept of open innovation is leading us to agreeing, globally that we need to be as liberal as possible with technologies. Some of them have been, patented for no particular reason, and we need to open up the ecosystem. And we have seen now a lot of, development around this. I think the U.S. Department of Commerce was holding some webinars last time, indicating that they are ready now to have discussion around ITA and all those regulations that have been existing in the past. And this is the kind of thing that we need to highlight when it comes to space, because such restrictions need to be relaxed so that the world economies can trade sustainably. So in terms of the security, I don't think there is so far we don't have any concern more regards to the IRIS square and the hangar, but I think there will be what is going to happen. There will be pilots that have to be tested before the rollout, and during the piloting, if there is any issue that can be highlighted, I believe it will be mitigated at that level or discussed at that level.
Right. Thanks, Mishak. And Samuel, if I may come to you also, I noticed in the chat box that Bogoba sent an article which will be useful to read about a kind of Africans coming together for a common front at Davos. One of the things we are also going to do at ASLI is that we have a program called View from the Sides, where we usually look back at international meetings and see the discussions that went on in that meeting, how they impact on Africa. So we intend to do that after the Davos meeting too. Samuel, thanks for your discussions majorly around the politics and military part of space in Africa. And I wanted you to touch a bit more on the impact of what I see as blocks operating in Africa. So now, of course, this is not rigid blocks, but you have a block seemingly led by like the US, of course, more related to Artemis, but generally looking at their leadership, basically. So last year, towards the end of last year, President Biden visited Angola, even though it was more around mineral resources. But of course, it was also an opportunity to talk about space also. And we know that in Africa, about 3 countries have signed the Artemis Accords. So do you see more African countries signing up to the accords? Where do you see South Africa in this whole scenario? Because, you know, South Africa has engagements with the US, but also has engagements with Russia. Another block, which is the BRICS, if you see that as a block also, and you see more African countries have joined the BRICS. And recently, I think I read that Nigeria and one other country have been invited to join the BRICS also. There's the North Africa, Middle East bloc also coming up. So generally, what do you see as the impact of these different blocks on Africa, both on the industry and on the ecosystem as a whole?
Okay, thank you for that question. I think some of these issues have been quite addressed earlier by the earlier discussant, but to put it in political and geopolitical perspective, there are so many emerging constellations around Africa, and even the major one of the major obstacles block against cooperation and collaboration of leading space players across Africa is still this issue of politics and geopolitics. Because considering the level of developments that South Africa has recorded in terms of the space industry and developing capacity in production of satellite and system and subsystem, there's little or no reason why some other African countries cannot work together with some of these companies and see a way to promote indigenous African brand rather than buying some of these assets from outside the continent. So in time of Artemis, I think South Africa is playing a very delicate balance in its relationship between with the US and emerging powers like Russia and China, while trying to maintain its traditional alliance or not a military alliance cooperation with Africa, with the US. Is trying to build, South African leadership are also trying to build and expand network of opportunities they can tap from China and Russia, which is a major subject of concern in Washington. And discussion and debate about around how Trump emergence in Washington, D.C. will shape its engagement or U.S. engagement with South Africa on this matter, because South Africa has taken certain position that some foreign policy strategies in the US or in Washington are quite skeptical or a bit critical. However, South Africa cannot ignore its national interest in the name of any country. So every country have their own national interest to pursue, whatever the case may be. So, however, analysts have considered the pros and cons, whether it's actually in South African interest, because South Africa have more trade relation with US than Russia in this case. And to recall, South African first military satellites was developed, built, designed and built in Russia. Although the planned follow-up, we are yet to hear anything about the planned follow-up. However, South Africa has developed a significant level of indigenous capacity in satellite production that can be leveraged in relation to other African countries. In time of other bloc, another worrisome trend is emerging in the Sahel, most especially in the Sahel. The relationship between Sahelian states, the new emerging alliance of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, and their close relationship with Russia is becoming a subject of interest to many people, especially in the ECOWAS bloc. The split in the ECOWAS bloc and the attempt to re-engage this country may become more complicated with the influence of external power in this case. Many people in this Sahelian state now view Nigeria, Ghana, and some other country as pro-West and pro-France. Meanwhile, some of these, what is actually happening now is what Nigeria and some other countries have been struggling to achieve in the past, to see a certain level of the linkage between France and the Francophone state to encourage more intra-African integration and cooperation. However, the way the incident occurred in time of the revolution, the wave of coup that occurred earlier, before this wave of disconnection with France, is a major subject of concern because it's also threatening the political regimes, the civil regime or democracy in most of these other West African countries. So the recent agreement with Russia in terms of satellite, they plan to purchase satellite from Russia by Sahelian states. I think the agreement contains development of 3 satellites, Earth observatory, communication, and a military radar satellite for security and defense purpose. So this is likely to receive response from other West African countries. As we can see, there's a growing number of West African countries are also taking interest in space and launching or planning to launch more satellites. Although Nigeria has been have a number of satellites in the pipeline earlier, the recent attempt or the attempt last year, or the agreement signed last year with Profos, is another indication of response, because it happened almost few weeks after the agreement with Russia and Sahelian state was announced. The Profos agreement in Nigeria was announced, and this follow-up chain of events may lead to what we don't like to call space race in the continent. So another dimension in the north, that's between Morocco and Algeria, and recalling that Morocco have border dispute with Spain, as well as animosity with Algeria. So issue of competition to raise capability, especially in reconnaissance and surveillance, intelligence gathering over this country, is very important, as space is playing a major role in all this area. So in terms of blocks, I think it's a major area of concern that African Union needs to step in and do more in terms of encouraging countries to look beyond competition that may lead to unnecessary rivalry, while exploring opportunity for collaboration. We can actually achieve more by collaborating together on the continent, because one satellite is not enough to gather significant intelligence for military and especially for tactical and operational purposes. It's not enough. So, but if we have constellation of satellites in Africa, it can actually go a long way to support our military. I'm not too sure whether South Africa, I'm not too sure the South African military satellite is still active, but we can use both civil and military or security satellite that we have, share information. South Africa has its troop in DRC Congo. If there are countries in that region that have satellite that can share information with South Africa, it will go a long way to improve their operation. Nigeria have some of its troops in other parts of the continent, either as training or in DRC Congo. In peacekeeping. So Egypt have its troop in Somalia, and some other African countries have their troops across the continent. So this kind of collaboration can go a long way to boost the capability of African military in peacekeeping especially. And this will reinforce Pan-Africanist spirit in terms of collaboration in space. So in terms of the message Africa needs to take to G20 and some other international forum, the major message I think we need to push forward now is Africa is open for collaboration and is open for investment in terms of space. although the African commercial sector, space commercial sector is opening up and growing gradually, but shortage of funding is still a major subject of concern for many of these companies. So investment in this area in terms of either collaboration with state, non-state, private actors is very important. So Africa is open to collaboration and investment. And intra-African collaboration should be prioritized, especially in terms of private to private actors, as well as government to private actors. Many of these collaboration or training, South African can actually work, do a lot in terms of its industrial capacity to support other African countries. And building bridges across all these divides is very important to raise confidence, because this is a matter of national security as well. So you can't share sensitive technology to a country you are not too sure it can become an hostile force tomorrow. So building bridges across multiple divides that we have across the continent and confidence building is very important at this stage. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yes, thank you. Apologies, I know we may go slightly over time, but I just need us to respond to just one final question, which I'll pose to all the speakers, which is as brief as possible. What do you, the 2025, what do you expect? What do you foresee coming up in 2025? And also, what are your maybe top 2 or 3 priorities, maybe as a professional or as an organization? As brief as possible. Kwaku, can I start with you?
Sure. I think I'll start with the second part, which is sort of what is the goals of Space Hubs Africa for this coming year. I think for us, a lot of it is trying to make sure that the local players and countries are being more active. So as an example, what we're doing this year is we're working with the Ghana Space Science and Technology Institute, as well as some of the local Ghanaian organizations to launch a national space conference. One of the lessons learned for Space Hubs Africa is that even if a country is quite active in the space industry, doesn't necessarily mean that the local organizations are working with each other at all, right? So, I mean, Meshach has mentioned a bit about what the University of Ghana and the Regional Marine Center have been doing, but a lot of the activities have been sort of very separate to a lot of the other space organizations within Ghana. So generally, from Space Hubs Africa perspective, for us, it's really the question of how can we ensure that locally and within each country, the active space organizations are actually also collaborating with each other rather than looking externally for support. So that's sort of one of the main things that we're focused on in Space Hubs Africa, trying to stimulate the local partnerships. In terms of what sort of the expectations for 2025 are, I think generally they're quite positive, right? So, I mean, the inauguration of the African Space Agency in Cairo in April with a conference will be a big marker, I think, on the continental level. But in general, I think we're seeing growing government engagements on the member state level. We're seeing increasing satellite launches. We're seeing a rise in private sector participation, expansion of ground station infrastructure. Generally, I think all of these things are quite positive, and I expect to see more over the coming year, as well as hope to see more training and capacity building, as well as more attempts to really bridge the funding and infrastructure gap, as well as have more of a participation in some of the regulatory frameworks and discussions that are happening on a global level.
Yeah, thank you, Kwaku. Meshach, let me come to you, your final remarks and your top priorities.
Thanks, Tim, for this opportunity. I think 2025, we are looking at, one is inaugurating the African Space Agency and moving to operationalization of activities. That's programmatic definition of the different domains. In terms of activities, we also foresee a lot of engagement, both internally and with external organizations or countries, collaborations. we seek to build more intra-African collaboration and coming up together with enhancing. It starts with the discussion level, and enhancing that particular discussion and exchange of information on what is suitable for the continent. Since the adoption of the space policy and strategy, things have changed, and we need to think about updating and looking at different areas of engagement and how to nurture the intra-African collaboration. Globally, we also, within the continent, we also expect some shake-up with the regulatory environment, and I think the Starlink model has brought a lot of concerns on the regulation on the continent, and we hope we foresee this as a platform for testing the regulatory environment. Globally, we also foresee slashing down of cost for access to space, and I hope that this will be a motivation for most of the African countries to also deploy their technologies and capabilities in space.
Great. So thanks. Samuel, final words.
Okay, thank you. I think last year we were able to organize a number of seminars at the University of Pretoria through the African Center for the Study of the US on Space. We are planning to follow up with that on US African Space Corporation, to follow up with another lecture series, as well as a book project. We also have a plan to develop a course on space diplomacy. I think I discussed with you earlier. So these are our plan for the year in terms of my fellowship in the University of Pretoria. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, Tongwane, to crown it up.
Oh, thank you so much, Etienne. All right, so I have a statement, and I think the vision is clear. The launch of the African Space Agency, based in Egypt, though serving the continent, is an extremely huge development for the collaborative efforts around Africa, having collective action and collectively being able to stand up as a region. We need to understand that there needs to happen this decoupling in terms of the International Telecommunications Union and being region number 4, which is tied with Europe, and how we can then leverage those various capabilities, especially around developing capacity and especially around investing in upstream as well as downstream capabilities around investment. The African Resource Monitoring Constellation was one such moment around 10 years ago, where we had this promise of a collaborative effort around the continent. And I'm pleased to say, I mean, as a private company, we've looked at developing constellations that stem off that in terms of FleetSAR and AgriSense being a business model, which is both commercial and serves government interests to be able to be beneficial from a commercial perspective in the market. But yes, we have the agency, we have business models. We're definitely looking forward to signing more contracts on the continent and really developing this market so that we can have a successful regional as well as local development of our market, and be able to seriously develop our capabilities in terms of doing business in space. Thank you.
Thanks, Tongwane. And we didn't have much time to go into different space activities or meetings that are coming up during the year, but of course we are aware of many of them, especially the New Space Africa Conference, which is coming up in April, which is co-hosted by the African Union. I think that's a major convergence point for for the African community. The other thing that is worthy of note is that I think at the regional level, there are also space meetings that are coming up also. In ECOWAS region, there is the Africa Space Economy Conference. Within the SADC region, there's the conference hosted by SANSA, the National Space Conference, which is growing up to be a continental event also. In East Africa, Mishak, I don't know, the Kenya Space Expo, I don't know that it's this year. It's usually every 2 years, the Kenya Space Expo. I think that's another one from that region. And then in North Africa, there is the Africa Middle East Space Conference. So at the regional level too, so a couple of things are happening. So I think it's, just to summarize what everybody has said, the year appears to be, to look bright, and we are all hopeful also, looking forward to see how things can be, I mean, African interests can be met and things can be beneficial for the entire ecosystem. I think I'll need to stop at this point. We've gone slightly over time. Thank you everyone for your contributions. I think it's been a very fruitful discussion. Thanks for staying up to this time. And we'll continue the discussion, we'll continue the engagement online and offline and physically where possible also. Thank you very much, and have a great year ahead. Bye for now.